Hey, this is Jesse from Yonder Lives. I'm actually recording this from the Noble Hotel in Lander, Wyoming, so if the audio sounds a bit off, it's because I'm in this echoey room on my MacBook. But during the first half of the season, we've had some incredible interviews with a wide range of folks, much of which never makes it into our episodes. Because we don't want this content to stay hidden in our Google Drive, we're going to start periodically releasing interviews in full for those who want to dive deeper into some of the conversations we offered in previous episodes. This will be our full interview with Len Necefer, who is a professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson and the founder of Natives Outdoors. Hope you enjoy it.
Len Necefer, University of Arizona, Natives Outdoors.
So, you wear a lot of hats. You have like a PhD in engineering and public policy, have worked at the Department of Energy. You're a professor. You're the founder of a company, Natives Outdoors.
Yeah.
You're on like a billion boards.
It's a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get here? I feel like at some point when we were talking, you said you like have a relationship to Flint, Michigan too.
Detroit.
Yeah, Detroit. Do you think you could give us just like a, brief as you would like, sort of just like story of your past decade of life and how you ended up where you're at right now?
Yeah. Oh, geez. A decade ago, I graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Kansas, and basically kind of spent the last few years trying to figure out what the hell I'm trying to do with my life, as most 20-year-olds do. But so I kind of headed down the path of doing aerospace research and worked at NASA Glenn for a hot second, and just kind of learned that like the more hardcore engineering path was not my deal. I mean, I don't like spending 8, 10 hours in front of a computer every day. I remember the way I would relate to that job in Cleveland when I was at NASA was just, I was, go to work, do that, but I was just so psyched to go mountain biking right after work. And that's what I looked forward to every day. And I just, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of been like being outside has been kind of a theme of my life for quite a while. So, looking back even further, basically it was, I grew up with a father who really valued the outdoors. He was grew up in Detroit, Michigan. He was a surfer when he was a young man and lived in San Diego in a van, so OG van lifer. And my mom came from the Navajo Nation. And so that side of the family, we were, mainly traditional healers and ranchers, farmers. And so a lot of the time I spent there was outside too. And talk about OG outdoor people, that's even more OG than my dad. So, but yeah, I mean, I just, like having that sort of upbringing, where being outside was highly valued and like seen as something as necessary to life, it would just kind of made sense that like the engineering stuff didn't really work out. But, in large part, the reason why I went into, so I shifted gears, applied for a PhD program. I ended up going to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and my focus was looking at energy resource development, sort of from a technical, social, cultural lens for the Navajo Nation. And so, my home community, that's kind of like an ever-present impact that's basically been had on the land. Like most of the Navajo Nation has been used as an energy piggy bank for the Southwest for the past 40 years, and that's mainly been through coal. And there's been a ton of uranium mining for nuclear weapons and things of that sort. So the legacies of that are pretty real and long-lasting. And so I was just trying to figure out what's the pathway for the Navajo Nation to move away from that and to just try to develop a more a less impactful, less extractive economy. And so that led me working in energy, and I worked at DOE for I worked there for a few years. And that job was really great under the Obama administration. And it took me to Colorado. I was working in Golden at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I wasn't actually with the laboratory. The DOE had its own separate building, but that brought me to Colorado. And at that point in life, I really my real only like outdoor sort of activities were like hiking and mountain biking and road biking. And in Colorado, there's big mountains. And, as a young child, I would always look at National Geographic and just be inspired by those images. And then just in my own upbringing, for Navajo people, our entire identity is based on four sacred mountains, two of which are in Colorado. And so I just kind of saw it as a way to like, I don't know, just get outside and see cool stuff. And I think the draw of the high alpine kind of sucked me in. It's like one of the few places where there's just absolute quiet. And that's kind of a hard thing to find these days. And so, I started spending a lot of time, and then slowly the things and places I wanted to go, like, started becoming more technical. And so I started developing, the different skill sets necessary to basically facilitate safe mountain travel. And so that's kind of where the climbing and skiing came in. And, up until that point in my life, I hadn't really done either of those sports, largely because they're just pretty cost prohibitive and expensive. And so, having a better paying job than, basically making more income than both of my parents for most of my childhood was kind of a trip. But I think it also opened a door in a big way just to see if these sports were something that I could, normalize in my own community. Just because there's access and there's opportunity right nearby the Navajo Nation. And so, the big thing is just the imagery stuff. So, I mean, just the lack of Native people in the spaces. And so, I did the DOE thing, and, having these questions kind of go through my mind, and an election happened and things radically shifted at the Department of Energy. And so I was looking for the door out, and that's kind of when I started that company. And, in large part, Natives Outdoors was just originally it was just an Instagram account to start showing Native people doing outdoor activities. In large part, it was just trying to create a community that I didn't feel like existed. And so it's been pretty phenomenal. And, and I think in the outdoor industry, I also started the company right before, right when the Bears Ears National Monument was being negotiated between the different parties involved. And so I got pretty directly involved with that. And then when the monument was rescinded, it brought me into contact with a lot of folks in the outdoor industry. And I think for, being someone that worked in the Department of Energy, has the policy and training and background to like talk about public lands and energy resources, and then also being Native, it just really served a kind of a niche role in the industry in a big way. I don't really see too many people floating around with PhDs in the space, which, it's fine. But I think with what I was trying to bring into that is just, Native people have a very legal and political existence. And I think that's, when we're talking about in the outdoor industry right now, there's a broader shift to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the discussion of the Bears Ears was kind of couched in that. And I think one of the things that I was really bringing to the table is there's a lot of legal and political questions that have to be dealt with here that is very unique to American Indians. And so, it's kind of been I got to say the last couple of years have been kind of a rocket ship. Part of that rocket ship was actually the Emerging Leaders Program with SHIP that I was a part of 2 years ago. And, I basically met a lot of amazing folks and colleagues that I still work with today, but also just getting connected to more deeply into an industry that I kind of saw myself in and wanting to make a change. So, it's kind of been a Looney Tunes show for the past 2 years for sure.
That feels real. And I just want to say that's a really impressive journey and really cool that you've had all these different hats and have also followed this really deep love for spending time outside. I agree with you a lot about mountains feeling like one of the only quiet spaces you can find some peace. But I think what you brought up about Bears Ears touches something that I think has sort of more and more entered public dialogue, kind of this tension between the idea that public lands are really important in conservation and have this whole history of importance to American people, but were also stolen from tribes. And I always think about, there's like this pretty famous Patagonia ad, I think that said like Trump stole your public lands, and then I can't remember who it was, but crossed it out and said Trump stole native lands, which I think speaks really well to that tension. So I'm just wondering how you think that the narrative, whether about Bears Ears or more just conservation of land in general, can be shaped to hold both of these truths together.
Yeah, it's like, that's definitely the history of, like, public lands and reservations had to be created together because they had to have a park for the four-leggeds and the two-leggeds, and yeah, I think kind of one of the things that I've seen broadly in the industry and just across the United States in general is, like, literally we receive almost zero education about tribes or sort of the complex history of settler colonialism and, like, the ways in which the impacts that's, like, sort of permeated through and the entire existence of Native people and, like, in the lands that we're on. So, like, you mentioned the Patagonia ad, and I think one of the things that I realized is that's just, like, it's coming from it's coming from a place of ignorance, and, like, I can't hold ignorance against people, because it's, at the end of the day, we exist in a system that basically isn't teaching people these important things. And so, my work, I see that as an opportunity to, like, meet people where they're at, to do that work, to educate, but also just, like, understanding that, when we look at, and basically saying public lands are stolen lands, it's like, yes, that's true. But then the next question is, like, okay, what then? And working with tribes and working with Native nations, like, the idea of repatriation and land back is kind of like, I think it's a really good idea. I mean, not a good idea, but it's, like, kind of a really complex idea. But also, not all tribes have the capacity to manage large swaths of land. Like, it's a very different context that we live in now than as compared to 150 years ago. And, I think that's kind of just given how many people live in the United States and the fact that it's not all Native people and there's just competing interests from all different sides, I think that's kind of where, having worked on, directly with tribes, directly on a lot of these issues, it kind of, I guess, more nuanced my view on it. I do believe that there's an importance of, like, empowering tribes, empowering Native nations, and also, like, making sure that they have a important seat at the table and that they also have a voice in discussions of management of public lands. And I think Bears Ears was one of those instances where, tribes really led that push and, like, use their status as sovereign nations to create conversation effectively force conversations with the Obama administration, the Department of Interior. But the part of the reason why, if it was just tribes pushing this, I don't think it would have actually been successful. You look at the fact that, many tribes don't have the legal resources to, pay the multitude of lawyers that this sort of takes. But also just, like, getting this in the public consciousness, like, Native people are 1 or 2% of the U.S. population. And so, one of the things that happened with Bears Ears that was really pivotal in a big way is that it was not just tribes that were working together. One of the things that I'm working on right now is a research paper looking at the fact that climbers were really pivotal in acting as a proxy for the entire outdoor industry in the discussions with tribes. And that was really important. I can't understate that enough, because one of the things that allowed for is that it allowed tribes in the outdoor industry to build a set of common values around this particular landscape, and also begin to hash out some of these differences in historical disagreements over things like climbing. My tribe, the Navajo Nation, climbing's banned because of a sense and, injuries that were happening in sacred spaces. And, and to see that, 40 years later after the signing of that ban, that the tribes, that my tribe and others were talking about how to protect this large landscape was really important. And I think, that was awesome because it basically, it created this coalition of folks that wasn't just Native people. And it, created much higher stakes. And then when the monument was rescinded, it was great because, maybe now some of the outdoor industry and some of these white folks understand what it feels like to lose, to have land taken. It was kind of this opportunity to educate of, like that doesn't feel good, does it? So like, I think it's more deeply, one of the things that has done is it's really entrenched some of the really important work and alignment between companies like Patagonia and the North Face and various tribes and Native peoples in the lower 48 and Alaska. So I just think from a political standpoint, it wasn't perfect in some ways, but also it's also created lasting connections between groups that historically haven't had that sort of those lines of dialogue.
So, I mean, you've already spoke to this quite a lot, but there is this growing overlap between the outdoor industry and sort of environmental and social activism that, like you're saying, is actually pretty sizable and having a pretty enormous impact. Here in Jackson, there's this funny sort of conundrum right now where we have what is it, Han? 250 nonprofits in town. It's something on that magnitude in a tiny town in Wyoming. Almost all of which are focused on the environment, and none of them are focused particularly on assisting folks on reservations near here. There's almost no conversation about Indigenous issues, despite the Wind River Res being just over a pass. And there's a ton of environmental activism here. But there's that overlap that we saw maybe at Bears Ears hasn't happened yet. Do you see if that relationship was going to start to be made in a place like Jackson, how would you imagine that occurring? I guess is my question.
Well, I mean, it's, I think one of the, when we look at our public lands and national park systems is kind of based on this very American myth of the wilderness, there's wild places that need protecting, and I think, I always kind of chuckle at it, because I look at other languages like Spanish, there's no word for wilderness. That's not a thing. And, there's a lot of, I think, it's kind of complicated. I can't just completely throw out John Muir and Samuel Bowles and some other folks that, a lot of people hold up to as being these champions of environmental protection. And, in many ways, they kind of created the public land system that we've inherited. And, and to see nonprofits then sort of have that be the centerpiece of their mantra of that these are wild places that people have never touched. It's not surprising because you look at more broadly, you think about how, if you were to go through your K through 12 education and then think about how much focus was given on Native issues and Native history versus the stuff that you may have learned in college or beyond, it's very different. And for most folks in this country, they only receive that first really incomplete picture. And, how that changes is, it's going to take decades. You look at the creation of the public land system and the entire framework and ideology that drives it, that took quite a long time. And I think if we were to transition it to something where Native people are a greater part of that picture, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time, and it's going to be really imperfect. And, for our, what we do at Natives Outdoors is basically we do some pretty extreme stuff in mountains. And we, look at these outdoor sports as, in many cases having indigenous roots in this continent, and like also have been used for very practical purposes. Looking at movement through landscape is a traditional ecological knowledge, and I think kind of it's kind of hard to see that in places like Jackson, or kind of make that gap, or fill that in. But one of the things that we've been doing in our work is just simply putting indigenous perspectives out there through the lens of outdoor sport, and like things like skiing or rock climbing or trail running, and having the sport and the visual media and the storytelling come out of it be sort of that, like what I like to call is the remedial education for the things that we should have learned in K through 12 education about where our public lands come from and the ways in which Native people then sort of interface with that. And so, one of the things that we just simply do is we provide the worldview. People can try it on, see how it compares and contrasts, and like, and it's through a medium that a lot of people, feel comfortable with. So it's kind of a way of meeting people where they're at, and also understanding that, there's a lot of people that are starting from ground zero on indigenous issues. And, it's going to take, to have any sort of larger impact, is going to take sort of swaying a lot of people. And so that's kind of where, what we look at is, that shared and common value. A lot of people love the mountains, they love the landscapes, but maybe they just don't know that there's 20,000, 30,000 years of human history underneath it. And so, and I think that's kind of, in reality, that's our secret sauce. And like, that's kind of where we've been really able to make some big waves in the industry around, I don't know, like skiing or climbing, whatever it is. Yeah.
If you were just to like talk briefly about a couple ways that this sort of the worldview that you're talking about, people trying on, differs from what you see as the sort of dominant outdoors industry worldview or narrative, what would those few things be? You don't have to go into huge detail, but I'm just curious.
We did there's a pro skier named Cody Townsend, and he's doing this big project called the 50 Project, and he's skiing. Well, it was the 50 greatest ski lines. 2 of them now no longer exist because of climate change. But we did one of these in the La Salle Mountains in southern, actually right near Bears Ears, right near Moab. And in that particular ski film, basically what we were doing is we provided a context of the place and who's lived there, who has used these mountains for medicine or to live in or whatever. And part of those, that's actually part of my ancestry is tied to that region. But then we basically use the framework of, these big ski mountaineering, sort of imagery, and to like tell these stories. And sort of that worldview is like, we go outside, one, to continue our connection to these places. And then also that these sports are not necessarily just sports for us, but they can also be forms of prayer, like being in these mountains. And that it's more broadly, when you look at indigenous worldviews and perspectives with the innate natural world, it's more based on a relationship of reciprocity. And that's, badass ski footage combined with that sort of worldview. It's kind of like I say, the candy, you give the candy with with the medicine. And so that's an example of it. And we've done that sort of with multiple pieces of work. And the other thing that we've done too is we've just built a number of allies who are influential athletes and given them these really deep cultural experiences with the land. We're just in Taos with Forrest Shearer, who's a Patagonia snowboarder, and we just went to, the longest and occupied building in North America, which was Taos Pueblo, built in, 1100 AD. And, just above where we're at, we were spending time in the mountains. And so to connect those two ideas of like long inhabitation of these places with these incredibly scenic and beautiful places is basically kind of pushing against that idea that like humans and people are separate from nature, and that like there's a long history of stewardship. And I think one of the things that I've yet to see more broadly in the United States is the full ownership of the fact that we're writing the next the next chapter of that history. And so our media is kind of to, and our work is to kind of help bridge those divides, build common values, and start to shift the narrative towards one of respect of the natural world, the history, that human history and natural history that it holds, and also just an indebtedness to making sure that we can pass it on to those after us.
That's really awesome. Yeah, I hope that continues to spread for a lot of folks. And I'm wondering if you were to sort of be designing like a top 5 curriculum for this re-education, if there are any books or movies, whatever you would point to, if in addition to Native Outdoors, that you would be like, these are some pivotal things that people who haven't really immersed themselves in that worldview could really benefit from.
If you're asking me, Len's re-education camp, I don't know if I like that sound. But,
yeah, we can get a better name.
We need it. We need something, dude.
Yeah, totally. That's a little too authoritarian for my feel.
Gotcha.
No, I think braiding tweetgrass has been making the rounds, and it's really important. I think just that's such an important book. And it touches on basically a lot of the themes I just mentioned, but this idea of reciprocity. But they also talk about the fact that a lot of recent immigrants and folks that have come here in the past 200 years, like figuratively speaking, still have one foot in the canoe and aren't fully willing to commit to taking care of the landscape. And one of the things that this book does is it describes Indigenous relationships to land, but also gives real permission to people who now live here, albeit more recently, to have those relationships with these places. And I think, more broadly, I think as a Native person, I think it's critically important that non-Native people begin to relate to landscapes as Native people do, because if we're going to address anything around climate change or whatever, we need some major cultural shifts in how we see ourselves in relation to the environment. Because in many regards, the policies and things that we then implement in large part are based upon our values, which in some indirect way also has a line to, as I like to call it, the software that we're ingrained with growing up, which is our cultural values. And so that book is really valuable. Dispossessing the Wilderness has been also making the rounds in the outdoor industry. I like to say I seeded that one with a lot of influential people, but it just talks about the creation of the reservation system and the public land system and the complex history there. There's another one called The Settler Colonial History of the United States. I've used that one in my class. I've actually used all 3 of these in my class that I teach. But the Settler Colonial History is just sort of this basically march from contact to present day history about the relationship between the settler state from the colonial era to now, to current time. And, I think one of the things is that, history is really, it's always really complicated when you're looking back on it. And I think one of the things that book does really well is it has as much compassion for the colonizer and the colonized. And I think in a lot of, Native literature, I've seen it kind of tilt one way as compared to the other. And, that's kind of hard if you do it retrospectively. And, the complex thing with Native people in this country is that there were some Native folks that supported and also advocated for the colonization of this country too. It's not a clear-cut line. But I think in that sort of messiness, it's like you're able to see the creation of the United States and like also these other sort of complex systems that we now have with like tribes and treaties and all of these other things. But also the ways in which Native people just tried to survive and the different tactics that made, that occurred. So I really like that book. It's a very solid piece. And, I think, and then it's just really doing your research and finding out who are the Native people where you live. There's the Wind River Reservation, of course, and in Jackson, and in Tucson it's the Tohono-O'odham. And for me as a Navajo person going to that part of the world, that's kind of one of the first things that I do is I try to learn as much as I can about the history of Indigenous people there. I try to learn about the traditional foods and the things that people, the local food economies of recent times is just knowing what Native people ate and like why that place was special. So that's kind of like the top level lens re-education camp.
Awesome. Thank you.
Heck yeah. It's really funny. I was using Dispossessing the Wilderness in a recent Knowles course I taught. And I hadn't really found this little part in the book before, but right at the end, there's this like short section. I think it's like actually in the conclusion where it's just talking about this Blackfoot elder and he's like, hey, you know what? Like, I'm actually really happy that all that wilderness up in Glacier actually exists. We like go up there and like still recreate just like you all. And it's like, we need to figure out what we're doing with it as we move forward. But the fact that it's like been in this case, I guess preserved, but conserved for so long has been really helpful to them in just maintaining culture and access to landscape in some ways.
Right. I mean, because I think one of the things that, that book talks about in that particular time frame is that there was such a major, I think looking back at the creation of the park system, like, I think it's like, of course, lands were stolen and like public lands are created, but like also on the flip side, like one of the real things that was happening at that time is that there was such a push for privatization and commercialization within the early United States that places like Glacier were like going to be like turned into these Disneylands, and so it was kind of interesting in that book to see the sort of internal politics and pressure, like conflict within the colonial state about how to best take care of these places. And, it was imperfect. But also like, that part, because the park was protected as a national park, it also prevented a lot of pretty egregious like development that was on the docket. I think mining was on the table in Glacier, and fortunately nothing was found. But, I think that's, I think as a Native person, I think one of the things that I see happening a lot is this sort of dichotomization of like, it's all bad, like Native land was stolen, blah, blah, blah. But like often history has so many more layers to it that often just feels like one component. And it shouldn't, like, sometimes it is the important component, but sometimes it's like, it's just a part of that larger puzzle.
Yeah. I think the other thing for me that both that section of Dispossessing the Wilderness and like honestly your work is serving to do, which I think is kind of a tall task, is just breaking down this like imagined, romanticized, mythologized Native American in the way that we're taught to imagine Native folks in this country, and thus like have no concept of it in our schools. In that same section, I think there's some point where that Blackfoot elder is just like, hey, like we want to hike. Like we go up there and hike, and like we like to ski. Like we're not like this. We're not out there like just harvesting roots. Like that's not what we do. We do sometimes, but like we're also there to recreate and like enjoy. I think he says like the abundance of medicines that the mountains have to offer. And I think
totally. I mean, I think one of the
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I think your work serves a similar incredible function in just breaking down this mythologized American Indian and like in a really like pragmatic way.
Right.
I really appreciate that.
I mean, I think, for Navajo tradition, like our entire medicinal practices is based upon like healing powers of the mountain. And like, you can imagine, like you can spend an entire day in the mountains and think about how you feel afterwards. Like literally that's our entire medicinal system is to get you to that point, of feeling just super chill, super bliss, like content. And yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of, an interesting thing that I realize like in a lot of my outings that I take folks on, like, taking these professional athletes out to these, these like places that just look really, I think to the untrained eye look really barren and stark and just kind of like, I don't want to say dead. Yeah, I guess we'd just say dead landscapes, kind of like the wilderness, right? And just kind of then breaking it down and saying, oh, like, here's a medicinal root that we use for this and this purpose. Like on this past trip that we did with Forrest, you know, it's the middle of winter, sort of. I was wearing shorts on our skin trip the other day, which was hilarious. But, you know, one of the things that one of the folks on our team was coming down with a cold, and there's like this green moss that grows on some of the pine trees. They're kind of like these long, woolly, kind of long bearded, light green moss, and they just hang, and that's a medicine for us. And so, you know, we're on the skin trip, and we're trying to like go find some untracked powder in these like north facing gullies, and like we just collected some medicine on the way up. And, you know, got to the top, ripped our skins off, and then skied down. And then when we got to the bottom, we made the tea. And I think like that layer of knowledge of landscape was really cool, but also just like, it also makes these places more hospitable when there's that sort of like knowledge that there's a lot of healing that these places can provide too. So it's been fun to go and blow some professional athletes' minds and give them you know, in many cases, a lot of them are looking for meaning and purpose in like why they're doing what they do. And, you know, I think for, you know, in the work that we've done, one of the things that we've seen is that the more time people spend outside and like their entire identity begins to merge with that of the natural world, there's more in common with the native people than like folks that don't do that, you know, and I think those sort of being able to understand what those shared values are, I think is kind of where I think there's a lot of potential for growth, and it also allows for the discussion of difference in a way that is more genuine and also a little bit safer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we want to be respectful of your time. And so I guess our last question for you is, first, this will eventually end up in some sort of audio. So we want to give you the chance to introduce yourself however you want, and whatever titles or characteristics you want to add for yourself, as well as just anything else, any parting thoughts you want to leave us with.
Yeah, what would it be? So the introduction and title, I would say Len Necefer, University of Arizona, Native Outdoors. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that because it will start getting a bit jumbled.
Perfect.
Yeah, I guess other thoughts. I think the one, you know, looking at, so in some of our work, like we're doing directly talking to, you know, the outdoor industry and engaging in that dialogue. But on the flip side, like one of the things that we do also with our media and work is just simply trying to like engage like stereotypes and perceptions in our own communities around these sports. You know, like I remember being told like climbing and skiing is like things that white people do, but there was this kind of, I always laugh because it was like, I said, well, I'm not necessarily white, so like, that doesn't hold. And, you know, it kind of made this person think a bit. But, you know, one of the things that for us is just also normalizing this idea of movement through landscape, because, you know, in a lot of our communities, like, yeah, we've been disconnected from these places. And like, you know, in the case of the Navajo Nation, like none of our sacred mountains exist on land, you know, Navajo Nation land. It's all federal public land at this point, and most Navajo people have never been there. And so, you know, in our work, it's also to sort of translate these cultural stories of these landscapes into sort of teachable education for our community too, because, you know, I always like to say that for many Native people, landscapes serve as like kind of a Library of Congress. And, you know, our entire knowledge set and what we know is embedded in the landscapes. And, you know, a great example is, you know, some of our sacred peaks, like you talk about what they mean, how they, you know, relate to the creation story. And then there's a lot of stories about, you know, where we came from as humans. And like, you know, it just goes on and on and on and on, but it like doesn't really click, in my opinion, until you go and like spend some time there. And so a lot of our work has just been simply trying to translate some of these knowledge sets into, you know, like basically media forms that a lot of young Native kids, like most of the rest of the world, are consuming as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess like to your point, Jessica, it's like incredibly pragmatic, and, you know, it's in like many ways, it's just, it's kind of with the understanding that it's going to take a long time to change cultures, worldviews, etc. And I think one of the things that in our work is that we just try not to get too bent out of shape about the history, because at the end of the day, if we kind of exist in that space, it'll burn us out really quickly. And we've been all the folks that we work on our team have all kind of grappled with being frustrated with the history, but also like that frustration on the left is like translated into some sort of action just basically starts corroding the vessel that it's in, and it's very easy to become cynical. And so a lot of the sort of outward-facing work that we do is simply just trying to chip away and just like understanding that this is like climbing a really big mountain and we're just like basically at the bottom. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of the parting thought I have.
Sweet. Thanks so much for your time, Len.